Adam Levin, welcome to the MindStew podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I'm really interested in talking about your recent paper, the HEALS Hemispheric Annealing and Lateralisation under Psychedelics paper. But before we get into that, could you tell us a bit of your background, who you are, where you're working, the sorts of things you're interested in?
Yeah, so I wear several hats. I'm a psychiatrist. I just finished up my training last year. And so, yeah, went to medical school, have that background. And then I also a postdoc scholar at the Psychedelic Center at the Ohio State University, which is where I also did my psychiatric training. And so I'm the medical monitor and I design the medical aspects of our protocols for our clinical trials. So we have a trial in veterans with PTSD where we use psilocybin assisted therapy, and about to start another one in patients with lung cancer with psilocybin. And so I work as the medical monitor, also a therapist on those trials. And so I have experience there. And then I also do a lot of just pure research, whether it's surveys or analyzing data related to different projects we've done. I spend probably half my time doing that, and so a lot of this paper, a lot of this theory, I think is informed by my clinical experience as a psychiatrist, going through training, seeing neurological injuries, neurological changes in people with different types of brain pathologies, and then actually comparing it to my experience in the therapy as a therapist, as a psychedelic therapist, and seeing people go through that process and seeing the overlap there. So I think that certainly my background informed this paper.
Could you say a bit more about that? That's really interesting that your clinical experience motivated this paper. Yeah, could you say a bit more about how?
Yeah, so as a psychiatrist in training, you go through a lot of different services like addiction service, child and adolescent service, and the consult liaison service basically is seeing patients in the hospital who are hospitalized for other reasons, and they're asking for help from the psychiatrist to help diagnose and treat. And so I saw a lot of patients with kind of severe neurological injuries from stroke or just traumatic brain injuries. And you start to notice different ways those pathologies manifest in people. And for me, the most interesting thing was the sort of experiential psychological manifestations of them. So I really was interested in how people's experience of themselves in the world was changing following these injuries, right? And and so a lot of the time you would see people who had the right hemisphere of their brain affected in some way through either a stroke or some sort of traumatic injury. And their world was just significantly narrowed in every aspect. Their world was narrowed, whether some people had full what's called hemi neglect, where the one entire side of the world, the left side, which corresponds with the right hemisphere, is just out of their awareness, not just their vision, but their awareness. Like they will deny that they have a left arm. They will draw a picture of a clock, and they will just draw half of the clock. And when you bring their attention to it, they kind of like make up a story about why it's kind of a delusional story about why it makes sense, right? Um, but then there are and so this is what happens when the right hemisphere is injured. Generally, this narrowing. The left hemisphere injuries don't result in this type of narrowing. So it's there's this difference that's kind of something I felt like we should be talking more about. Why is this happening? Like the way I would learn neuroscience basically was that there's no difference between the two sides of the brain, and it's kind of inconsequential differences. But so I started to observe this. I started to dig more into that literature, and there's a fantastic author called Ian McGilchrist who's written a lot about this specific topic, and I saw him noticing these patterns in a much more detailed and fleshed out way than I was. But then, so I noticed that, and then I'm also doing psychedelic therapy through our clinical trials. And I'm seeing this phenomenon of people coming to us with these pathologies like PTSD or depression, having this narrowing of their world, and then the psychedelic experience opens up to these insights and these realizations that they hadn't had before, which is well documented phenomenon. It's a often discussed. But then the interesting thing with these neurological patients with the right hemisphere injuries is that there are ways to stimulate the right hemisphere to make it activate briefly. And there's many cases in the literature from 50 years ago where they would stimulate the right hemisphere and people would all of a sudden say that I've been missing this entire side of the world. Like, how have I not seen that? They'll recognize the left side of their body. They'll see all of a sudden things will make sense. And then that window closes. And that was really that moment, those insights were the overlap between psychedelics and this phenomenon where somehow the stimulation of the right hemisphere under conditions of injury are opening up these insights about the world, widening the lens. And that's happening too with psychedelics. So it made me think, well, is there something here? Is there some way in which psychedelics are interacting with this phenomenon with the right hemisphere?
Yeah, fascinating. Well, let's dive into it then.
Yeah.
And yeah, see how you brought that all together in this paper with the heels model.
Mm-hmm.
Could you I guess firstly just summarize the key hypothesis, and I guess explain the title, the heels acronym?
Yeah. So the key hypothesis is basically that psychedelics are enhancing the right hemisphere function in a way that is atypical in normal states of consciousness. So in normal states of consciousness, the left hemisphere is sort of dominant. It is narrowing the attentional window to focus generally on what it can manipulate, what it needs to manipulate. And so it's very evolutionarily important, that function. But it's really restricting a lot of the information that comes in from the right hemisphere. And the hypothesis here is that under psychedelics, you have this atypical, I call it annealing. So it's this mix of the left and right hemisphere that's not typical. And then it's lateralized. So it's more shifted in the rightward direction. So you can imagine, under typical conditions, the left hemisphere is dominant, the right's a little bit smaller effectively. And then in this, it's sort of this shift where they're mixing in a new way. They're mixing in this novel fashion. And that's why it's both annealing, I think, and also lateralization.
Yeah, I want to dive into sort of the evidence
Mm-hmm.
around this, but just firstly, this, we're talking about the hemispheres of the brain here. This isn't um, a particularly micro phenomenon that we need really cutting edge techniques, or it's not something that's just very deep in the brain. So yeah, why isn't this sort of idea spoken about in the existing theories of how psychedelics work?
I think one main concern, and this is true of all of neuroscience as it relates to lateralization and hemispheres, is that it got kind of tied up in this pop culture idea of the right hemisphere being the artistic one, the left being more about math. It kind of got turned into a meme. And so just generally neuroscientists, and I think many scientists, just became allergic to it because it's clear that idea is clearly an oversimplification. And so it kind of went out of the mainstream. But what I learned, and what I think mostly learned from Ian McGilchrist, the psychiatrist who I was mentioning, is that it's not that one or the other specifies in a specific task, like the right hemisphere only does creative work and the left only does math. It's that they're both engaging in everything you're doing, but the way that they're engaging in it, the pathways that they're using are different. And that's a much harder thing to convey and to communicate and also to test. And so I think it gets pretty easily dismissed and lost and overlooked. And so I don't think it's a psychedelic field specific thing. I think it's a wider phenomenon. But I think it has affected the psychedelic field because many, as I mentioned, many of the leading theories are focused in the top down, the frontal lobe, the axis of the brain that has to do with the relationship between the top and bottom, essentially, of the brain. And so that's my theory about it. Another aspect of it, just to add, is that when all this work was done and people won Nobel Prizes related to this, there was a common operation called the split brain operation, which essentially was a cutting the corpus callosum, which is the connector between the two hemispheres, as a way of stopping seizures, stopping epilepsy. So then there were ways to directly interrogate each hemisphere with psychological tests, with all kinds of approaches. And so that was a huge contributor to the neuroscientific field back then. But now we don't do that procedure anymore. So I had to, I had to look back at a lot of those old papers from the 60s and 70s to even find this stuff. So maybe my feeling is that some people just aren't aware that this research exists.
Interesting. All right. Well, let's dive into the paper and the evidence that you marshal here for this theory.
Mm-hmm.
Not sure how best to go about it. You lay it out, I guess, with a more concrete sort of task-based or neuroimaging-based evidence first, and then in the paper you go to, I guess, people's experience or how the hemispheres, the difference in people's experience with, I guess, impairments or disconnection between the hemispheres, how that relates to psychedelics. Should we follow that same structure?
Sure. I think that makes sense. I think I started off with the imaging. I think the first thing that I did when I had this idea was actually to look at the imaging, because I felt like I had an intuitive sense for some of the reality of the experience. For all the reasons I mentioned, I was pretty familiar with the experience of people with brain injuries and the experience of people with psychedelics. And I was like, there's some overlap here, but the imaging, I had no idea. So I tried, and it wasn't a systematic analysis. It wasn't, it was systematic in the sense that I went through all the imaging I could find and tried to identify some of these patterns. And what I continued to find was evidence of lateralisation. Often it was confusing and conflicted, but if you read through it, I think there's clear evidence, especially in the earlier imaging studies, which used PET scans and other things, that there is this rightward lateralization of blood flow in many cases under psychedelics. And so all I wanted to do was to point to this kind of possibility. I'm not claiming that this is definite, but I'm just saying there's enough evidence for us to look into this. But it was interesting because as I was going through these papers, even recent papers, the last few years, I found many other researchers commenting about lateralization and saying, hey, we should probably look more into this, because it seems like, I think Fred Barrett, if I'm remembering correctly, one of their team's papers basically concluded with saying we should look more into the possibility of these effects being lateralized under psychedelics. And so that was reaffirming for me, in a sense, because it was people coming at it from another direction, the imaging direction, which I am, openly not that familiar with, and kind of saying this is something we should look into.
Yeah, and I found this part of the paper where you were talking about different imaging techniques and what they can show us about lateralization super interesting. Could you try to explain some of that?
Sure. So this is another potential reason why lateralization doesn't come up often, is that imaging often uses this subtraction paradigm where you're comparing sometimes each hemisphere, you're taking the right and the left, and you're subtracting out basically everything that's coming up, and you're catching the peaks of the differences. So you're seeing how this peak activation in the left hemisphere is correlated with XYZ. But oftentimes it's not the peaks, it's a wider low level activation of different regions that's actually more associated with what's happening. And so you're kind of many of the imaging studies are kind of zeroing out some of the potential differences between the hemispheres, or they're not looking at it specifically, and they're just they're focusing in on these kind of peaks. And I think that's a big one. Again, I'm not an imaging expert, but it seems like that's one of the big reasons why some of this stuff is missing, not only from psychedelic studies, but just general studies.
So from your understanding, is this model and brain lateralization under psychedelics something that can be studied with fMRI, or is it really other modalities that are going to need to be used to test this?
I think it can be studied with fMRI. I think again, it's not my expertise, but I think if you go into it with the hypothesis that lateralization exists, I think it's easier to look at it. And so I think it's definitely doable. I also think that from my point of view, as I mentioned at the end of the paper, there are probably other approaches and other ways that we could go about looking at this that would give us a cleaner understanding of what's happening. For example, actually just administering a psychedelic to one hemisphere of the brain, which my understanding of this is that it would be possible based on the fact that we can anesthetize one side of the brain versus the other. So I think those are cleaner ways. And, with fMRI generally and functional neuroimaging, the interpretation of it is it's increased activity in one area does not necessarily correlate with increased brain activity. It could just be inhibitory. It could be so it's that I think is a larger problem. So I would favor trying to use other techniques, but I think fMRI is the most widely available, widely known. So I think it could definitely be used in this context.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I had no idea that you could administer anesthesia to half of the brain and then
Mm-hmm.
potentially administer psychedelics to the other half.
Well, this
Yeah.
is a lot of the studies I looked at, or many of them were, it's called the WADA procedure. And so they would anesthetize the left hemisphere and ask the person questions, ask just the right hemisphere questions, which raises many interesting, questions about consciousness itself and what it means to be conscious, and then do the same thing for the other hemisphere and get different responses and different answers to the same questions. Right. And so, again, that's another example of this. These experiments have been done and we have this knowledge, but it hasn't quite been incorporated into what we're doing now.
That's fascinating. That'd be such an interesting study to run.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What about, okay, so that's neuroimaging, some indications there in that literature,
Mm-hmm.
and people saying we should look at this more. Could you take us through some of the uh, other streams of evidence that you looked at?
Sure. So, another interesting area was these binocular rivalry studies. And basically what rivalry is this presentation usually of two different image percepts to basically each eye, and there's usually there can be a fusion of the images, but typically the brain focuses on one image or the other, right? And this can be different, and it can present it can depend on the person, but generally that's how it works. And so early on in the field of psychedelics in the 70s, there was interest in how psychedelics affected this and how psychedelics changed binocular rivalry. And one of the interesting things that corresponds with the right hemisphere is that when under psychedelics, people are more likely to experience the mixed percept state. So they're more likely to remain open to that multi-layered combined image than they are to choose one image or the other. And that function, that closing down of the state, happens through this left hemisphere closure, right? And so the right hemisphere is involved in keeping this open state, this openness between the percepts, right? And that's been pretty well documented. And so that was one line of evidence where people were actually testing this with psychedelics, and there's studies looking at, people with split brain, meaning, only one hemisphere, interrogating one hemisphere. And so there was clear overlap there.
Pretty clear indication from that line of research of psychedelics having a similar effect um, to say split brain patients or just other scenarios where the right brain is predominant.
Yeah, and also another interesting thing was that the experiment, which was done under ayahuasca, looking at this split percept, it was basically looking at these gradings, like a horizontal and vertical grading, and whether the horizontal lines came up or the horizontal or the vertical lines came forward under ayahuasca. And in this experiment, which was done in 2003, they saw that there was a shift in predominance of the vertical grading. So there was more of the mix, but people also saw for longer periods this vertical grading. And it's interesting that, and I'm not sure if I included this in the paper, but the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere gravitates towards horizontal, like reading and sort of like the way that lines are structured horizontally, but the right hemisphere is much more focused on the vertical and on vertical lines and vertical images. So that was another kind of supporting corollary.
So that's binocular rivalry.
Mm-hmm.
What else was there in terms of evidence?
So I guess the most direct evidence was from, or if this could be done again, which it wouldn't, it would be extremely direct evidence, but it's a lesion study done under psychedelics. So basically, there were over 20 patients with epilepsy, and they knew, and many of these patients had tumors or lesions, meaning injury on one side or the other of the brain, and they were well localized, meaning they knew exactly where they were. And the group with, and they sorry, that's my dog barking. They gave each of these people LSD, which certainly wouldn't be allowed today. But back then, this was 1965. It was an experiment that was allowed. And what the authors found were that the right-sided lesions, the right-sided epileptic lesions, showed greater sensitivity and reactivity to LSD. So they had greater subjective effects than the left-sided group, and their kind of hypothesis was that these epileptic lesions created this greater activation of a sensitivity of each hemisphere. And so the right hemisphere, which was already sensitive to psychedelics, was being even more activated. And so they basically conclude that the right hemisphere response is due to fundamental differences in each hemisphere in their response to, in this case, LSD. So there's a lot of debate and kind of challenge to this conclusion, but this was the author's conclusion.
Just so I completely understand this, the people who had lesions, some sort of injury to the right hemisphere,
Mm-hmm.
were the people who experienced greater effects of LSD.
Yes, and it was the lesions, but also the epilepsy was localized in the right hemisphere. So their right hemisphere had sort of increased reactivity, basically, because of the tumor or whatever it was. It had increased reactivity to stimuli, presumably also to LSD.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. And what's contended there, or what are the sort of alternative
Well,
explanations?
the alternative explanation, right, is that the right hemisphere is damaged by the lesions, right, and so the lesions are actually interfering with right hemisphere function, and therefore, what the LSD is actually doing is activating the left hemisphere more. And so so some people are saying they concluded the exact opposite thing. That and that could be true, right? You can't prove it without imaging. But the authors concluded the authors actually cite another paper, a similar paper where people with epilepsy in the right hemisphere, where some of the memories were stored, were these memories were more easily elicited by electrical stimulation, basically, when they had epilepsy in the right hemisphere. So what they're saying is it's a sensitivity that's being enhanced. It occurs when people have stimulation of emotions and memory under epilepsy, and so the normal function basically is it's enhanced. And so, it's and this is why it's important. It's like it's one paper, and it's interesting and it's fun to note that I actually had a discussion or an email exchange with Dr. McGilchrist about this topic, and we disagreed about this precise study because it's so hard to interpret. But that's what it's about. I mean, I think that's why it's not about reliance on one paper or one study. It's about trying to bring all of this to light and trying to have interesting discussions and further studies to look into it. And that's what's so fun, I think, about science and bringing this conversation forward too.
Yeah, well, the paper certainly does cover a lot. Yeah, it really brings together all these different lines of suggestive evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Should we turn towards the phenomenology now?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. I think this is the heart of the paper,
Yeah.
and it it covers this idea that um, that each of the hemispheres is essentially a conscious system in its own right, which is words from Roger Sperry, who was awarded the Nobel Prize for looking at this split brain research, and that both the left and the right hemisphere, as he would say, are conscious and simultaneously kind of often conflicting ways. And so their experiences are running along in parallel, essentially. And the way, and giving full credit to Ian McGilchrist, the way he frames it is that each hemisphere has a different take on the world, and that these are running along in parallel, and they're often in conflict. But what maybe arises out of that is our conscious experience. But because of this idea of the two takes, you can, and the history of looking at these split brain patients and these anesthetized patients on each hemisphere, you can really elucidate what those two takes are like and what those two takes are. And again, what I was noticing as I was delving into this literature was the overlap between the right hemisphere's take on the world and the world for people under psychedelics.
Can you go into that? Can you explain some of the most striking ways in which you saw that?
Sure. So just briefly, the left hemisphere has this narrow focus, as I mentioned kind of at the beginning, and it's focused on parts versus the whole. And that's one big aspect of it. And it focuses primarily on inanimate things as well. It deals with the manipulation of the world of things. So it has this kind of narrow manipulation focus, whereas the right hemisphere is much more focused on the wider picture, the broader lens, and it's much more focused on living things. It's the social, it's where our social and emotional intelligence functions largely. And and so, first with attention, right? For example, just looking at attention alone and mentioning that narrowing of the scope, under psychedelics, there's just a lot of evidence for attentional broadening and attentional widening. And I think that, this takes many forms, and there's been, a lot of papers and hypotheses about this, but probably the original, right, is the doors of perception, which is Aldous Huxley hypothesizing that the mind's acting as this kind of reducing valve. And what psychedelics are doing are releasing that valve and allowing for the flow of more information. And it turns out that Huxley was, based on a lot of the neuroscience that's emerging, Huxley was probably right about a lot of this. And this has been tested in a lot of ways. It's been kind of Robin Carhart Harris's theory has kind of validated this from a top-down level, and same with Franz Vollenweider's theory about this kind of tonic filtering of these lower networks. But my theory is inserting this new idea of this release of the right hemisphere and this broadening of attention, right? And so and this is very consistent. And yeah, so that's one aspect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense in terms of attention, broadening the attentional scope with the right hemisphere and under psychedelics.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, what other dimensions of experience are also changed in that same pattern?
Well, so one interesting thing to notice as well is I sort of mentioned this, what I call vitalization versus devitalization. And it's the world of the living, essentially, of living things and of life, versus the world of things and kind of dull matter. And so there's this continuum which is present in science, right? Where we have the world of living things, sort of like animals, and then we go down to bugs, and then maybe some people go down to grass, and some people go down to rock. The further you get down the line, the less likely people are to attribute life to things. Sort of the general pattern. But what's interesting is that under conditions of right hemisphere enhancement, and also in psychedelic states, people are much more likely to attribute life further down that consciousness and life further down that gradient. So I cite one paper where I cite a few studies. I cite one where, under conditions of right hemisphere damage, patients view their own limbs, their own bodies, as mechanical and dead. And they get kind of lost in these lifeless, view themselves as robots, or these kind of delusional thoughts. But in contrast, when the left hemisphere is suppressed through TMS or other approaches, people begin in those moments to see the world as alive. And there's one woman in this paper who says, the moon is alive because it moves in the sky, or a stone is alive because electrons rotate within it, is the quote. And that, again, looking at people's experiences under psychedelics, and this is a paper Sandeep Nayak published, which showed that this was like thousands of people in a survey, were much more likely to attribute consciousness to both non-human mammals and to inanimate objects after their psychedelic experience. So, and just also interesting to note that many indigenous traditions that use psychedelics as part of their process, as part of their culture, have this animistic worldview of respecting everything, of the rocks and the trees having life. And so that is, to me, this kind of clear phenomenological overlap.
I'm interested in how different theories account for this. So you talked about in terms of attention,
Mm-hmm.
There is an explanation that sort of presents itself if you're looking from, say,
Yes.
a top-down rebus type model.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, on this aspect of vitalization, are there other accounts of why psychedelics do this?
I'm not aware of any. I guess I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of someone with one of these other theories. So I guess it might be that the relaxed beliefs under psychedelics model, right, is that you're sort of relaxing your beliefs about the world and letting if your belief about the world is that, the world is dead, plants aren't conscious, um, the typical kind of hard line materialist view. And then you have this kind of release, and there's more data coming in. There's a flow of this bottom up information. Then you're opening up your mind to new interpretations of the world. But what I point out in my paper, and what I don't think has been done adequately, and I think Sandeep Nayak even says this, is that there's no way to account for the directionality of these beliefs, because the beliefs tend to go, like I was mentioning, towards life and towards animacy. So it's not really a random, amalgamation of beliefs that people are putting together. They seem to be tending towards a specific direction. And my hypothesis for that is that it is the right hemisphere's view of the world that is asserting itself or being recognized. And, I don't think that other theories quite account for that. I mean, I might be wrong, but um, I think that's part of the appeal, I guess, to me of this theory, is that it's accounting for this kind of directionality.
Yeah, that was also something which really made me interested in this paper, and just more generally theories of psychedelics that are very non-specific, that only focus on, let's say, like neuroplasticity enhancement, or a non-specific amplification.
Mm-hmm.
All these sorts of things, they might well be accurate and clinically important, but yeah, personally, I want something that also accounts for the phenomenology.
And the persistent pattern of the insights, and the I talk a little bit here about kind of spirituality um and altered states of consciousness, and the insights that come from that, this shift towards spirituality and towards the recognition of some great mystery, really. And that tends to come from these psychedelic states. Now, is it a random sort of belief that people are formulating, and that you know is that pattern not is that pattern explained by sort of randomness, or is it a view of the world, like so spirituality, the right hemisphere, for example, is much more open to mystery and to ambiguity and to paradox and to the idea of being in a relationship with something beyond oneself. And so when I hear all of those things emerging, that's what I think. I think it's and the interesting thing for me is that, you can try to make truth claims about some of those assertions, and maybe study them in ways that go beyond just neuroscience. And you can look at physics and say, what does physics say about some of these claims? And because if it's a matter of which hemisphere is perceiving what, then reality, it's which is the reality, right? And so that's some of what's fascinating about it to me as well.
You're talking about the different takes that the hemispheres have on
Yes.
the world, and which is a better reflection of,
Yes.
or a fuller reflection of reality.
Exactly. And the insights that come from psychedelics, and so Jill Bolte Taylor, who's someone who I read I used and cite her book a lot. She's a neuroscientist who went through a traumatic brain injury, lost her left hemisphere, had a stroke, wrote a book called My Stroke of Insight. And she talks about her experience basically encountering this right hemisphere world and how central social and emotional relationships and love, and how language is located in the left hemisphere primarily, just isn't fully capturing reality in a sense. And so she had this basically realization through her stroke that her sense of reality, her sense of filtering reality, which was primarily based in her left hemisphere, was severely lacking. And so much of her communication about this has been, I think she would probably even say, putting forward the right hemisphere view as legitimate and important.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned Jill Bolte Taylor. I think when I saw her TED talk, it was her description of the right hemisphere was, or her experience after her stroke was one of the first things that got me onto this topic of hemispheric lateralisation and psychedelics, because the
Yeah.
parallel obvious.
Yeah, for me too. I mean, you hear her talk about it, and you're struck by just the overlap with a psychedelic experience, and it's and another area of overlap that I haven't mentioned is like social, and briefly mentioned, but is social and emotional intelligence, and the ability of the right hemisphere to empathize, understand, and contextualize the feelings and experiences of other people. And that is most of that is located in the right hemisphere, most of those processes. And so it's interesting in reading the work of Benny Shannon related to ayahuasca, how people under ayahuasca and other psychedelics as well, I mean, this has been well documented, they feel like they have an increased understanding of other people, that it's almost a level that they're able to read people's minds. And this is particularly well documented in ayahuasca, but also in other psychedelics. And Jill Bolte Taylor, in her account of her experience, she says, I think people with left hemisphere damage could essentially be lie detectors, because the right hemisphere is so good at interpreting these kind of social interactions and cues, and has so much empathy that she kind of jokingly says it could be a lie detector, right? And then we have all of this research, a lot of research related to increase empathy under psychedelics, increase emotional empathy. And then we have personal accounts of people under psychedelics having this increased empathy. So yeah, that was really striking to me. And another, just to add on to that, the chemist who first found named ayahuasca, found the alkaloid, isolated the alkaloid in ayahuasca. Wanted to call it telepathine, just acknowledging that feeling of empathy and connection. And yeah, so I just remember reading Jill Bolte Taylor and saying, this is an amazing overlap here.
Mm. Yeah, and another aspect that comes to mind of her story was her loss of language. Remember
Mm-hmm.
how she's realizing something's
Exactly.
going on, and she picks up the phone and she's trying to talk or
Exactly.
understand. And you touch on this as well. So can you say a little bit about language in the hemispheres?
Sure. So language is interesting, because language is actually one thing that we do learn a lot about in medical school. We learn about the areas of the brain that are almost always in the left hemisphere, Broca's and Wernicke's areas. These are for speaking, interpreting language. And so we know about lateralization of language. And, you know, but we think that leads us to think, interestingly, that, well, the left hemisphere is the smart hemisphere, the left hemisphere is the dominant hemisphere. This is where language is located. And the right hemisphere has even been called like in the past like the dumb hemisphere, the non-dominant hemisphere. But the interesting part about that is how well does language really describe the world? Like, does language fully encapsulate the reality that's going on? I mean, most philosophers and scientists would say absolutely not. And so the right hemisphere has other ways of communicating and other ways of understanding other people. And so the two big ones that I highlight are music and metaphor. And metaphor is particularly important in the right hemisphere, particularly strong. Understanding jokes, understanding just different kind of opaque references is the province of the right hemisphere. And so under psychedelics, people produce more surprising and novel metaphors. This is work that's been done by Weibner, and conversely, people with right hemisphere damage have problems with understanding metaphor, and um, and it's just an interesting kind of another interesting corollary that under psychedelics and in right hemisphere enhancement, it seems like vocabulary can become impoverished. Like people have difficulty with words or with kind of certain words, but there's more flexibility and creativity in language where people sort of are combining different words um, or sort of expanding their ideas about what certain words are. Um, so that's one thing. And then I can talk about music too, because I mentioned metaphor, but
Yeah, please.
music is has a special relationship with the right hemisphere, and only rhythm is processed by the left hemisphere. Everything else, pitch, harmony, tone, resolution, that's all in the right hemisphere. And we know, I mean, many of us in the psychedelic field know the importance of music in the psychedelic treatment and know that psychedelics enhance this experience of music. And this has been tested, many times. This heightened aesthetic appreciation, this heightened depth of experience in the music, all of that is enhanced under psychedelics. And also, I cite some of these kind of incredible cases from Oliver Sacks is the neurologist who wrote a whole book about this called Musicophilia, I think. But he cites people who had left hemisphere damage and then developed this these new abilities to relate to music and to whistle in new ways and to sort of enhance. And there are even cases of composers who showed enhanced ability following left hemisphere strokes, and of course the opposite. And what it made me think of immediately was this phenomenon of people being trained in shamanic ayahuasca traditions acquiring this ability to sing and to learning songs, they would say, in these traditions from the plants, and developing a repertoire of icaros or songs that come to them as they engage with ayahuasca. And it just reading these stories about patients, right, with left hemisphere damage suddenly acquiring songs essentially was just an amazing and really interesting, corollary.
Yeah, it's just making me again appreciate the sort of parsimony of this theory. There's so many aspects here that we've been talking about, all interesting in their own right. But when you're taking them as a whole and the pattern of the directionality that this model suggests, I think it seems to me that it does a lot of explaining that if you don't have this hemispheric lens, you really need to. There's an onus to make a whole lot of specific explanations.
Well, exactly. And I have here Sandeep Nayak's quote, because I think this was actually validating for me to see, where they write, this is a quote, "We appreciate that weakening of high level priors could allow low level information to strengthen certain beliefs, although this would not predict the directional regularities of belief change observed in the present study." So basically, they're saying this doesn't account for, and they're talking about the belief change towards animacy and towards life. Um, and so, yeah, I think I appreciate you saying that. And I do think, I mean, it's not the only answer, certainly, but maybe it could be part of the picture, right? Part of the
Mm.
picture here.
Are there any predictions that this model would make?
I think so. One possibility, I think, one prediction would just be that if you administer psychedelics to each hemisphere separately, somehow using one of these techniques, that the right hemisphere response would be more powerful. I think that would be one prediction that I would have. And yeah, it's interesting because I've heard from several researchers who are working on this in this area saying, please send me your paper, like let's connect, because I'm finding some evidence for lateralization. And one is a team in France, who I forget the university they're associated with, but basically in animal models, they're finding, in rodents, they're finding these selective differences on a cellular level between the hemispheres. And one of the researchers said, when I was emailing with them, that it's almost as if the right hemisphere is controlling what's going on in some of the left hemisphere during this. But this is like very preliminary and just interesting. So I think, one prediction would be this increased sensitivity of the right hemisphere. Another would be clear differences, maybe even on a cellular level, and even in animals, when you're administering psychedelics. And yeah, I guess there's also the possibility of, um, using some of these tests that are more specific for hemisphere differences. And, some of those, um, are, tests of attention, or tests of, different cognitive functions that you could, under psychedelics, like binocular rivalry is an example of one that has been done before, but you could really do a large study of binocular rivalry and try to understand exactly what's happening.
And would the idea be that you would see changes in all these dimensions? So you would see, yeah, the phenomenological changes, like a shift to perceiving more vitalization or more aliveness, as well as, the changes that you explained in terms of binocular rivalry, et cetera, would be this whole sort of global shift.
Yes, that would be my hypothesis. Um, and also to be validated by imaging if possible, which I know less about. But my hypothesis would be that you would see shifts across these different areas, and that many of them might persist. And so I give the example in the paper of mindfulness, which mindfulness has been very well documented, to be associated with or strongly correlated with changes in the right hemisphere structure, changes even in the cortex, which not just functional changes, like structural changes in the cortex. And what many of the studies under psychedelics show is increased enhanced mindfulness for weeks and months after psychedelics. So looking at that and doing imaging with that, and kind of looking at different functions kind of across the board, and hypothesizing based on the right hemisphere function versus the left hemisphere function.
All right. Well, as we start to wrap up, what is coming up next for you, and I guess in general, but also any future work that you're doing on this
Yeah.
topic?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that I want to add to this, from a higher kind of level, is that, um, sorry, my dog is barking, but is that if people under psychedelics are often reporting, often experiencing this feeling or experience of the inner healer. And what they mean by that is it's this encounter with something familiar that they recognize somehow, that is essentially almost an immune system of their mind, brain, spirit, however they frame it, that's helping them to heal. And it seems incredibly familiar, and it's a recognition often under psychedelic states that they're reporting. And again, from a very high level, it sounds like this, maybe what they're encountering is their own right hemisphere, and they know it's there because it's functioning in the background all the time. It's functioning in parallel, but they're re-encountering this, and it's leading to this rebalancing, this kind of rebalancing of their mental health in many cases, or of their worldview in some cases. And that is overlapping with the worldview and the approach of many indigenous Eastern approaches that emphasize this movement towards wholeness and towards balance, and these conceptions of disease and healing more as a rebalancing versus a sort of assertion or insertion or doing something. And so it, again, like another confirmation or just another area of interest for me, is how the whole idea, the whole approach to healing in the West may be sort of informed by more of this left hemisphere worldview. Whereas what psychedelics might be enhancing or changing or introducing is this more kind of balance based, wholeness based worldview into psychiatry. And so I'm very interested in that. I often feel pulled in many directions, or in multiple directions, because I'm a psychiatrist and I'm pretty firmly grounded in that scientific training. But I'm also aware of many of the shortcomings and the misunderstandings of the current kind of Western medicine based worldview. And so that's a significant area of interest for me, and something that I enjoy exploring, not just scientifically, but also philosophically.
And any specific projects that you have planned on these topics?
So right now, my main focus, I put this paper out there, and I've had some interaction with it with different researchers and different ideas about grants that we could create that would directly test this. And so I think, um, moving in that direction will be a longer term project. But right now, my primary focus is on our trauma, essentially, and working with veterans with post traumatic stress, PTSD, and also shifting my focus and completing a project on collective trauma. Um, and I actually just completed a field research project in Israel, related to the collective trauma of the 7th of October, and interviewing people at one of the main sites of the terrorist attack was a psychedelic festival. And so basically I spent 2 weeks there interviewing people about their experiences with psychedelics, and not just the individual trauma, but moving into the collective and collective experience. And so that's an area of interest for me, and it overlaps with anthropology and just many different areas. But that's the direction that I'll be taking for for the foreseeable future. And then with Heals, with this paper, just continuing to hopefully interact and talk about it and get new ideas and explore it with people who are interested.
Well, yeah, really appreciate you doing that today with us. Yeah, walking us through the ideas and just sharing what seems like a um, just a neglected and overlooked but useful lens on how psychedelics work.
Sure. Yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time to interview me and being thoughtful about it. And yeah, I'm hopeful that people reach out and we can talk about it and get more ideas.
Yeah, where can people reach you?
So if you Google my name, it will come up probably on CPDRE.org, which is the Center for Psychedelic Drug Research and Education at Ohio State University. And that's will have my bio and my email. I'm not on social media or anything like that. Uh, but email would be great if anyone wants to reach out.
Great. Well, thanks again, Adam. It's been fun.
Yeah, no, it's been amazing. Thank you so much.